Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 93 called Anatomy of a Regime. So far, most of this podcast has been about Justinian's foreign policy, his endless wars and the enemies he faced on all frontiers, as well as, of course, the spectacular natural catastrophes that struck the empire in the form of climate change, famine and plague. But we've spoken relatively little about Roman society, and this is really because we have so little information on it. Now, in this episode, I'd like to look at what evidence we have, and you may be surprised to hear that one of our best sources has lain silently in the sands of Egypt for over 1,000 years. Yes, I'm talking about papyrus documents. So let's go back to the year 1896 and the ancient city of Oxyrhynchus, about 120 miles south of Cairo, when two young English classical scholars, Grenfell and Hunt, discovered an estimated 500,000 papyri documents preserved under the sand in several rubbish dumps. They were mostly in fragments, and the two Englishmen collected the pieces and put them into boxes and sent them home. Over the next 100 and more years, a tiny number of these have been painstakingly pieced back together. So far, only about 5,000 papyri, or 1% of the total number, have been restored to a condition where they can be read. But even just this small sample has provided us with some minor unknown works by Plato, the playwright Menander, the poet Pindar, and many other less well-known ancient authors. Christian and Jewish texts are also abundant with some of the earliest known copies of the Old and New Testaments. It looks likely it'll take hundreds of years to go through the entire collection, since the work of deciphering and piecing the fragments together is laborious, and there are relatively few papyrologists and almost no funding. An attempt to speed up the process using volunteers at Oxford University between 2014 and 16 failed when it was discovered the papyri were being illegally sold for profit. But what we have so far is still very useful, especially since 90% of the papyri comprise mundane everyday transactions such as legal petitions, court records, sales, leases, wills, accounts, inventories, codes, edicts, registers and private correspondence, the sort of things that we hardly ever find in ancient civilizations. And we're fortunate many of these relate to the 6th and 7th centuries AD. So, what do they tell us about Justinian's reign? The first point is society was dominated by the big landowners. They had estates cultivated by agricultural labourers, legally not designated as slaves, but as coloni adscriptici. These were free men and women, but ones who were essentially tied to the estates of the rich. They were paid for their labour, and in return they paid rent for their board and lodging. The fragmentary papyri show some of them left to find a better life. Others lived beyond their means and fell into debt, whereupon the estate managers were ruthless in punishing and fining them. It's worth mentioning at this point that Egypt was by far the wealthiest province in the Eastern Empire. Indeed, this had always been the case ever since it was annexed to the Roman Empire in the days of Julius Caesar. And in the age of Justinian, this was more true than ever before. Indeed, it's been estimated that nearly half of all the Eastern Empire's tax revenues came from Egypt. The Nile region was one of the most fertile on the planet, providing a huge wheat harvest which supplied Constantinople. But Egypt's wealth extended far beyond just grain. It also exported textiles, papyrus, highly prized utensils, and a menagerie of exotic animals such as camels and African birds. The papyri from Oxyrhynchus, as well as from another site, Aphrodito, illustrate clearly the three-way conflict between the big landowners, peasants, and the state. They tell us about both rich and poor. On the one hand, we have a family that was one of the richest in the empire, and on the other, that of a small-town hero, a lawyer who devoted his career to protecting the poor against the rich. Let's begin with the landowners. The Oxyrhynchus papyri provide copious information about a family called the Appians. They were a perfect example of the type of landed aristocracy that became powerful in the late Roman Empire in both East and West. Because of their wealth, they mostly lived in Constantinople and were absentee landlords. One member of the family was even elected to consul in 497. Their web of business activity was wide and prominent. For example, the Emperor Anastasius appointed one of them, Flavius Appian, to supply the Roman army with grain during the Persian War of 502 to 506. He's even mentioned by Procopius as being, quote, an extremely efficient man of eminence among the patricians, end quote. The Appian family seem to have fallen in and out of imperial favour. The Flavius Appian who supplied Anastasius's army was subsequently exiled. So maybe he was guilty of embezzling government money, who knows? But he made his peace with Anastasius's successor, Justin, and even recanted his monophysite beliefs in Justinian's reign, presumably to appease Justinian, who was anti-monophysite, something we'll discuss shortly. His descendants continued their lively interaction with the Roman emperors until the family disappears from history in 626, when the Persians conquered Egypt. Much scholarly ink has been spilt over what the relationship between the great landowners and the state was really like. Were they a cooperative oligarchy, or were they at loggerheads? I suggest the answer depended on who was emperor. Anastasius was an aristocrat who enjoyed the support of most of the wealthy landed class, but his successors, Justin and Justinian, were outsiders. As discussed in episode 73, Justin seized the throne because the aristocracy were too divided to field a suitable candidate. When Justin died, Justinian's ruthless politics ensured he had no real opposition. Because of this, Justinian's government was, in effect, a tyranny, and the Nika riots showed just how unpopular he became. After crushing the rioters, he cowed the Senate and the landed class, as Procopius described. Quote, he turned to his own advantage the insurrection against him known as Nika. End quote. Procopius also tells us, quote, Justinian ruined the great landowners, end quote. But we know Procopius was a spokesman for the aristocracy in the old order. The truth is more likely that Justinian, being an outsider, was more motivated to fight the landowners than Anastasius had been. One bone of contention was tax collection. We know that in the Eastern Empire, the big landowners often collected tax from their estate workers to be sent to Constantinople in a practice termed autopragia. This was obviously useful to the state, which didn't need to employ tax collectors, but it also created many potential problems for central government by delegating such an important activity to a third party. Indeed, it made the Roman state semi-feudal, dependent on the big landowners' cooperation in remitting the taxes of the peasants. And this was something Justinian was keen to fight tooth and nail. Evidence for this lies with papyri discovered in the ancient settlement of Aphrodite. These concern the life of an Egyptian small-town lawyer, Dioscorus, originally born into a lowly peasant family, but who, showing that social mobility existed at least for some, escaped the drudgery of agricultural life to gain an education and probably studied law in Alexandria. His life is illuminated by an extensive number of papyri fragments detailing legal contracts, letters, accounts of proceedings, and even numerous poems written by him. Unfortunately, he wasn't a gifted poet, and one historian has commented that his poetry was the very worst that has survived from all of antiquity. But Dioscorus was a better lawyer than poet, and he worked to protect the poor from the demands of the rich. In particular, he resisted some brutish landowners named Theodosius and Julian, who he accused of pocketing the tax collected from the peasants. This even brought him into contact with Justinian himself when, in pursuit of his case against the landowners, which by then involved a suspicious murder as well, he took his case to Constantinople. The emperor shared his concerns. We have examples of Justinian's legislation in which he tried to clamp down on similar tax abuse by the landowning aristocracy. The result was Justinian supported the humble lawyer. In 551, in response to a second trip by the indefatigable Dioscorus, Justinian wrote to the governor of Egypt praising the lawyer and ordering a full investigation into the matter. Our last papyri concerning Dioscorus show him, now an old man, still fighting the rich on behalf of the poor. So the events of Dioscorus' life suggest at least some of the big landowners were corrupt and defrauding the state of tax revenues that would otherwise have been paid directly by the peasantry. This somewhat contradicts Procopius's commentary in the Secret History when he tells us Justinian, quote, appropriated all the money he could lay his hands on, end quote. But it doesn't exonerate Justinian completely. He was still, in my view, guilty of financial mismanagement, spending too much on his western campaigns and leaving the army weak on the Danube and eastern frontiers, as we discussed in the last episode. Justinian still failed to manage his budget, in contrast to Anastasius, of whom Procopius rightly said, quote, Anastasius has shown himself the most stewardly and bursarial of all the emperors, end quote. Justinian's position as an outsider keen to assert his authority was shown just as clearly in his religious policy. He was the most religiously intolerant emperor since Constantine steered the Roman ship of state away from paganism and towards Christianity. He persecuted pagans and homosexuals and promoted himself as the leader of the church. Probably the most striking aspect of Justinian's religious policy was his anti-pagan stance. Not since the Emperor Theodosius in the 4th century had the state taken such an adversarial approach to pagan practices, which were probably still widespread in the empire. In 529, Agathias says he closed the academy in Athens, thereby snuffing out the last major centre for philosophical debate. 7 of its philosophers fled to Persia, only to be disillusioned that Chosroes was less of a philosopher and more of a tyrant. At least this is Agathias' story, which some historians say marked the end of the ancient world. Although some historians doubt whether this really happened, the spirit of Agathias' commentary is certainly accurate in my view. Justinian directed persecution against pagans not just in 529, but our sources suggest also in 545 and in 562. For example, an inscription from Sardis in Anatolia dated to the mid-6th century records a list of pagans found guilty by the local judge. In around 540 we hear of Manichaeans in Constantinople being burnt to death. He was also intolerant of homosexuals. Procopius describes how those charged with this offence were castrated and paraded through the streets. Why was Justinian so vindictive towards pagans and homosexuals? I suggest it was part of his battle against the aristocracy. Most of those accused of being pagan were almost certainly among the better educated, like those at the Academy at Athens, and like Procopius himself, who'd studied classical literature. It's no coincidence that our two main chroniclers of this age, Procopius and Agathias, who both reviled Justinian, were also admirers of classical literature. His vendetta against homosexuals may also have been politically motivated, in that the only individuals known to have been persecuted were bishops who he may have wanted removed. However, Justinian's focus on religious policy, with himself as the supreme pontiff, ran into a significant problem. The Christian world was deeply divided between three main areas: Constantinople, Rome, and the cities of Antioch and Alexandria, which normally operated together. Indeed, a fourth existed if we want to include the Nestorian Church in Persia. All of them wanted to be independent of each other. None of them wanted to be subservient to the others. Rome was the most vocal proponent of its own independence, since it was the furthest from Constantinople and had achieved a degree of freedom under the Ostrogoths. I suggest the division in the Eastern Empire was simply a power struggle between the capital, Constantinople, and the other two principal cities in the empire. Although I can't prove it, I strongly believe that to the man or woman in the street, the religious nuances which generated such controversy would have been as incomprehensible to them as they are to us today. You recall that even the superbly well-educated Procopius famously dismissed this ecclesiastical wrangling as nonsense. Quote, "I consider it a sort of insane stupidity to investigate the nature of God, asking what sort it is, for man cannot, I think, accurately understand even human affairs, much less those pertaining to the nature of God." End quote. For Justinian, the religious divide was further complicated for him personally because he and his beloved wife Theodora stood on opposite sides. While he identified as a Chalcedonian, she was a Monophysite. The strong personality she was, there was no giving in to him on this issue. Added to this, he genuinely seems to have feared that the catastrophes of the 540s might suggest he was the object of God's displeasure. These factors motivated him to find a solution to this religious division. But he never succeeded. Instead, he vacillated between accommodating the Monophysites after the Nika riots in 532 and then expelling the Monophysite Patriarch of Alexandria, Theodosius, in 537. 16 years later, in 553, he staged his most serious attempt to find a compromise, similar to what the Emperor Zeno had done with the Henoticon. He convened the Second Council of Constantinople. This was a big event, with 152 bishops attending. Ecumenical councils like this could only be convened by the emperor, the last one having been in 381, held by Theodosius I. Justinian's strategy was to propose something that everyone could agree on. You recall that the basic disagreement between Chalcedonians and Monophysites was over the nature of Jesus Christ. Chalcedonians said he was both human and divine at the same time. Monophysites said he was entirely divine. Justinian's idea was to unify the two sides by getting them to agree on something they could both condemn. and he chose another obscure part of Christian doctrine called the Three Chapters. This referred to the writings of three Nestorian bishops who'd long ago been expelled as heretics and had fled to Persia, where a powerful Nestorian church developed. It was agreed that both sides would unite in condemning the three chapters. One notable dissenter was the Pope Vigilius, who Justinian had summoned from Rome. Justinian actually had him imprisoned until he recanted, but many of the bishops in the Western Church refused to recognise this. Justinian hoped he'd brought Chalcedonians and Monophysites closer together, but in reality they were still just as far apart, indeed arguably even more so than at the beginning of his reign, since the Monophysites developed their own separate church hierarchy in defiance of the fact that their senior bishops like Severus of Antioch and Theodosius of Alexandria had been deposed and replaced with pro-Chalcedonian ones. These religious differences represented a growing division in the empire that would, in due course, prove especially damaging when, in the 7th century, it undermined a united Roman opposition to both the Persian and Arab invasions, something we'll discuss in future episodes. But back to Justinian, we're nearing the end of his reign, with peace bought through tribute paid to the Avars in the north and to the Persians in the east. He made one last military adventure. In 551, a small Roman fleet sailed for southern Spain at the invitation of a Visigothic pretender to the throne, Athanagild. In the ensuing Visigothic civil war, a Roman outpost was established at Cartagena. The southern Spanish coast was now officially Roman. With control secured of the entire Mediterranean coastline except for southern Gaul and northern Spain, Justinian could claim his conquests had in effect returned the Mediterranean to the Mare Nostrum of the old Roman Empire. Another success, probably of much greater value to the empire, was also achieved at some point in the 550s, although we don't know the precise date. This was the theft of silkworm eggs from China. Until then, silk had always been bought at enormous cost from China. In the classical empire, Pliny the Elder was so worried by the amount of gold flowing east to buy silk, which he claimed was only wanted by Roman women to flatter their appearance, that he feared it would bankrupt Rome. In fact, the barbarians got there first, as we know. But silk had remained popular in the Eastern Empire until some monks offered to Justinian to travel to China and smuggle back silkworm eggs feeding on mulberry leaves. Justinian paid them a fortune to do this, and soon a thriving silk industry was established in the environs of Constantinople. Justinian's last years were uneventful. By the 560s, he was an old man, said to be preoccupied with religious contemplation, perhaps about why God seemed to have abandoned him in the second half of his reign. On a cold night, the 14th of November, 565, at the age of 83, he died in his sleep. His nephew, Justin, rushed to the palace. He'd been waiting for this moment for months, if not years, and now he seized it with consummate political skill. His allies were already lined up: the Patriarch of Constantinople, the palace guards, his senatorial supporters. They all joined in proclaiming him emperor. Next stop was the Hippodrome, where the mob could make or break emperors. They gave him the thumbs up. No one wanted trouble. There was enough of that lying in wait for the empire already. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. The next episode will be in 2 weeks' time on the 29th of June, and I'd like to ask a favour. If you like the podcast, could you leave a review and or recommend it to a friend? That would be fantastic. The podcast is entirely free, requires no subscription, and doesn't even have adverts. And of course, do also check out my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes, to find maps, blogs, books, and also a free ebook. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.